Hi, let's start the chapter, please. This class we will talk about chapter 5 is cross-border trade and investment. Some of you guys have done some assignment about NAFTA and you're aware of the what's international trade and investment. Now, the reason we're talking about international trade and investment is the fact that Um, they are made of one of the driven forces of international trade and investment and cross-border trade is international companies or international business. So we need to know what's in international trade and international cross-border trade in order to have an understanding, general understanding what's in the what it takes to do an international business. Now, here what we're talking about, we will be talking about mostly about theories, and then we're going to talk about practice later on. The economics arguments surrounding the benefits of a cost, benefits and costs of a free trade is a good and service are not abstract academic argument. They are has a practice sense in it. And when we are talking about here, we're talking about the theory and the practice part of it is the fact that international trade theory has shaped the economics policy of many nations in for the past 50 years. And you are fully aware of some countries who used to be way below the poverty line and now it's much better, like China, like Korea, like Dubai. So these are cities or countries that were way below the poverty line, and now they are very wealthy and rich countries. So it was it was the driver behind the World Trade Organization and regional trading blocs such as European Union, NAFTA, the North American Free Trade Agreement. An overview of a trade theories is basically one of the god of the economics, Adam Smith theory of absolute advantage. He proposed in 1776, Smith's theory was the first to explain why unrestricted free trade is beneficial to a country. Free trade refers to a situation where a government does not attempt to influence what its citizen can buy and sell between each other or internationally. So there is no taxes, let's assume, or tax on everybody, something that are less restricted. There is no restriction at all. That's when the free trade happening. Now, an overview of a trade theory building on a Smith work or additional theory. So what we're doing here, we bring in the Smith theory and we build the international addition work on it. And it's one is a theory of competitive advantage also done by David Ricardo. So he took a Smith theory and built a trade theory. Ricardo works was refined by LA and Bertil, whose theory is known as Hackshire Oehlein theory. The great strength of the theories of Smith, Ricardo, and Hampshire Offline is that they identify with precision the specific benefit of international trade. So basically, this theory, the free trade, was got evolved eventually about driven from Smith theory. Now, the benefit of a trade is the gain of trade arise because international trade allows a country to specialize in the manufacturing and export of a product that can be produced most efficiently in that country, while importing a product that can produce more efficiently in other country. Let me give you an example. Is like I use this example. Say if I'm really efficient in cutting trees and not good in sewing the t-shirt, and my neighbor is good in sewing t-shirts but not good in cutting trees. So it's more beneficial for me is I focus on cutting trees and he focus on sewing t-shirts. And whenever he needs, woods or the trees, he comes to me. I give it to him, and in return, he gives me T-shirt. We are becoming specialized in something, because I'm not making. If I decided to make T-shirts and cut trees, I have to trade some of my time to doing T-shirts, and I might be not good at it. So it might take me longer time than my neighbor does. And this is also applicable in general in between countries. The benefit of a trade, according to this theories of Smith, Ricardo, and Hacksher Ohline, show why it is beneficial for a country to engage in international trade, even for a product it is able to produce it itself. If you're able as a country produce it, but you're not efficient, you're not cost effective, you better to get it from somewhere else and you focus on things that you are efficient. Now there is some exceptions, but mostly it's this applicable, and the exception we will be talking about it in chapter 6, the next chapter. But in general, many Canadians believe that to help save Canadian jobs from foreign competition, Canadian consumers should buy a product produced in Canada by Canadian companies whenever possible. Now, the theory of Smith, Ricardo, and Hacksher Ohlin tells us that the country may gain if it is citizen buy certain product from other nations that could be produced at home. The gain arises because international trade allows a country to specialize in the manufacture and export of product that can be produced most efficiently in that country, while importing product that can be produced more efficiently in other countries. Let me give you a very extreme example so you understand what they are trying to say here. If you look at the Saudi Arabia, is a desert city, desert country, has full of oil. And if you look at the Canada, has oil, but it's lots of trees there. So it's very beneficial for the both that Saudi Arabia export oil because extracting oil from the land from the ground costs around $5. In extracting oil from the ground of Canada costs around $35. So more efficient that Saudi Arabia take oil out of their ground and export it partially to Canada than Canadian export their own oil, for example. On the other hand, because Saudi Arabia is a desert and it would be very costly for them to grow trees because they need good waters and good land and good soil. So it's easier for Canada to export trees and wood products to Saudi Arabia than Saudi Arabia growing that, even in the case of wheats also. it's easier for Canada to grow wheat and export it to to Saudis than the Saudis growing on their desert land, which is they might need so much soil and water to do that. So these are the benefits of the trade. So while importing product that can be produced more efficiently in other countries. Now, the pattern of international trade, the theory of Smith, Ricardo, and Hacksher or Lynn also help us to explain the pattern of international trade that we observe in the world economy. Some aspects of the pattern are easy to understand, like Saudi Arabia and Canada exporting and importing oil and wood. Some some aspect of the pattern are easy to understand. The climate and the natural resources endowment explain why, for example, Ghana export coca, Brazil export coffee, Saudi Arabia export oil, and China export ginseng, and India export services, for example, and spices. The patent, some aspect of the patent are difficult to understand. The leading to the new trade theory. So when we are not understanding, and was extreme examples of between Canada and Saudi Arabia, we can understand it really well. But we need to also understand why such a trade happening in NAFTA between USA and Canada, where they're similar to each other. And here where you develop the leading new trade theory. The new trade theory stressed that in some cases, countries specialize in the production and export of particular products, not because of underlying differences in factor endowments, but because in certain industries, the word make market can support only a limited number of firms. So let's say in certain industries, the word support limited number of firms. So in case of oil, why always mostly comes from OPEC, yet the other countries might have oil. And the reason there is certain level of oil consumption that is needed in the world. And if it increase more than that because of more firms producing, more countries is producing, that not only the price of oil goes way down, the storage of oil, excess of oil, will be very costly. So they only support certain level, certain countries to produce oil in the world. And mostly, you notice, is OPEC and Russia, that they are really exporters of oil to the world. And in America, you got Venezuela. So here's where mercantilism is an economic philosophy advocating that countries should be simultaneously encourage export and discourage import. But the problem with that, you cannot just blindly encourage export and import and discourage import, because the flaw in with this was it because it's viewed as a zero sum game. In other words, what they look at it saying, when you're exporting, there is an income, and when you're exporting, there is an expense or payments. So income minus payment is what your purchase power or your wealth. And they're assuming that everything equal with the zeros. But the issues here, to export that products in some country costs you $1 and in some country costs you $50. And you need to take that into consideration, which is mercantilism does not take that into consideration. So there is what you call absolute advantage. A country has an absolute advantage in the production of product when it is more efficient than any other country to produce it. Just like what we talked about in Saudi Arabia versus Canada. And here, an example you looked at as used in the text to explain why Korea would produce rice and Ghana would produce coca. And the reason, because Korea are much efficient, their land is more good, well fit for rice. On the other hand, Ghana is more fit for producing coca, and they can trade that with each other. In the same example, also applicable between Saudi Arabia and Canada. Here, I'm not going to talk about the process and the numbers, but as I said, and I brought earlier example of, to make it simple, the t-shirt and cutting the trees. If I'm good in cutting trees and I can cut 10 trees a day, and if I decide to make my own t-shirt, which is going to take me some time to make my own t-shirt, so I have to stop cutting 3 trees for 1 t-shirt. And I have an option of trading 1 tree for 1 t-shirt with my neighbor, because my neighbor is good in cutting and doing sewing, but he's bad in cutting trees. So I rather to cut 10 trees and trade 1 tree to my neighbor and get a t-shirt. So I end up with 9 trees and 1 t-shirt. But if I decide to cut trees and make a t-shirt, so by if I make 1 t-shirt, I end up making only cutting 7 trees and 1 t-shirt. If I'm working on my efficient, I end up cutting 9 trees and 1 t-shirt if I'm trading. If I'm not trading, I will end up with having only 7 trees and 1 t-shirt. This is where the trade and gain comes from trade. So there is what you call a competitive advantage. Theory that countries should specialize in the production of goods and services that they can produce most efficiently. A country is said that they have a competitive advantage in the production of such good and service. Just consider me who is cutting 10 trees, country A, and consider my neighbor who's sewing t-shirts is country B. So it's better we trade with each other, and I will end up with 9 trees and 1 t-shirt, and he will have his 1 tree that he's looking for. So it's also used to explain the Ghana why it's competitive, more efficient to produce coca, and then make rice and coca, leave the rice to Korea and produce coca and then trade, and they will be bottom line, they have more income or wealth. So the Hager-Ohain theory predicts that the countries will export those goods that makes intensive use of factors that are locally abundant, lots of it, while importing goods that make intensive use of factors that locally scarce. Like Ricardo theory and Ohain theory argue that the free trade is beneficial. So the trade between, say, Canada and Saudi Arabia, there is abundant, lots of oil in Saudi Arabia and easy to export it, easy to take it out from the ground and export it. There is oil in Canada, but it's not easy to take it out, not abundant, not on the top, so easy to get it. So that makes sense that these two countries trade worth of $10 billion between them, maybe much, much more than that. Now, the product life theory, Raymond Veron's theory, driven from that, which is using a product life cycle theory, went to argue that earlier in the life cycle of a typical new product, while demand is starting growing rapidly in United States, demand in other advanced country is limited to high income groups. Union's argument that most of new products are developed and introduced in the United States seems ethnocentric. He's saying when the income of a country is becoming higher and higher, there is certain demand get triggers. And according to that demand, people start buying. For example, if you look at the China, once their income now is growing, so suddenly there is a demand for a better mobile and for better cars. They have a demand for cars now. In the early days, because they were under the poverty, lots of under poverty line, they couldn't afford buying car. So China stopped producing car because there is a demand for it. And but on other hand, you see their cars is very economic and small. They're not interested to making big cars like USA. USA, because of the ethnocentrics, when they started producing cars, they produced big cars with, consume plenty of gas. In China, when they start producing cars, they produce an economic car. Same thing with Japan. So according to the ethnocentrics of the people, the next stage of production, it differs. In the new trade theory began to emerge in 1970 when a number of economists were arguing that the increasing return to a specialization might exist in some industries. And they start talking about the economies of scale, which is represent one particular important source of increasing return. Economies of scale are unit cost reduction associated with a large of output. So if you have taken economics or cost accounting course, you know there is if we're producing any unit, there is two part of it. There is two costs. Cost is fixed cost per unit, and you have the variable cost. And the fixed cost per unit is basically comes from or driven from total fixed costs. And the total fixed cost, to calculate the fixed cost per unit, you take the total cost divided by number of units that you are producing. The more you produce, the less is your variable cost per unit. Okay? When it's the less your variable cost per unit, the less fixed cost per unit, I'm sorry, the more you produce, the more you produce, the less is your fixed cost per unit. Add to the variable cost, which is, each unit has its own cost, which is called variable cost. You add them both, becomes less and less the more you produce. So this is what we call economies of scales. It reach up to a point when then start switching. But let's think now on keep going down the total cost per unit, and that's what you call economies of So the more you produce, the cost per unit is lower. Now, so the theory, the new trade theory, is driven by on this law, and increasing product variety and reducing costs. There is another way of thinking: is the consequences of the small national market. What happened when a national market are combined into the larger world market? So there is a small national market, and you start producing cars, producing weeds, producing computer, producing, and you do that for your small national unit market. But once you are combined with the international, your cost per unit is really high because you're not producing lots of unit, you're producing limited unit. So your total cost per unit is really high, and other big nations can come in, or the world market can come in and compete with you in your local country, and that's what might has some of the products that you produce, line of product, might disappear. So there is what you call the national competitive advantage, and here where he Porter's looks at it, and it brings comes up with a Porter theory, and it's the competitive advantage actions determines that four broad attribute of the nation shape the environment in which local firms compete. And these firms promote or impede the creation of competitive advantage. So one is demand condition. Let's assume you have a demand for a local production. You like your local car. So no matter what kind of cars comes in a market, cheaper or something, you have a demand for that car. But if you're looking for a lower price, then you're very much open. The second, relating and supporting industries. So steel manufacturing in Iran, for example, is pretty cheap because lots of steels. Producing cars, because consume lots of steels from then the cost of producing a car is low because the cost of getting the steels is cheap. So these are relating and supporting industries. Factor endowment and firm strategy, structure, and rivalry. So if somebody is planning to come in and they compete, they have to give, for example, have a better product or produce a better product, more customized product, or cheaper product in order to compete. So it depends on what your competition also is thinking. So overall, the determinants of national competitive advantage using the Porter's diamond theory is the fact, first you look at the demand conditions, then you check in the related and supporting industries. You see the factor endowment, like do you have enough income to buy cars, more than one, or two, three mobiles, and the firm strategy locally and internationally, and their structure and how they are competing with each other in for the local market. And they're all related to each other, these factors. Now, the implication for international business. There is a three implication that we need to look at it also when we are analyzing the international trade and international why international business fit within needs to understand the international trade. One is location implication, the first mover implication, and the policy implication. And location implications is different country have a particular advantage in different productive activities. So sometimes you will see a product that 50% is a Canadian product, 50% of it produced here, and the rest is coming from other countries where it is cheaper. So it makes sense for a firm to disperse its productive activities to those countries where, according to the theory of international trade, they can perform most efficiently. An example, a McDonald's that's produced in Saudi Arabia, the sandwich. Well, the meat itself comes from Spain. The lettuce comes from, I believe, Italy. The wheat of the bread is from Saudi Arabia. And the mustard and the spice that puts in the Big Mac, it comes from USA. The reason they have a better product there or a cheaper product, so they bring it to all together to give somebody in Saudi Arabia a Big Mac. So there is a efficiencies performed there. Now, first mover application implication, firms that establish a first mover advantage with regard to the production of a particular new product may subsequently dominate the global trade in that product. It pays to invest substantially resources in trying to build a first mover or early mover advantage, even if that means several years of substantial loss before the new venture becomes profitable. In chapter 6, we will talk about it in detail, but here what we're going to say, we're going to explain it for you why first mover is important. I will, bring a personal uh, situation. After a new era of Iraq started, they are technology hungry country they were. So they established two telco companies. When they established the two telco companies, I and my company, which is was working for, we were the first mover to provide core solution, telco core solution for two major operators in Iraq. They serve over 30 million subscribers. Since we provided the core solution, we managed to, be in the middle of all the solutions. When we went there, we were implementing core solution application. We suggested using Nokia or Ericsson's as a switches. And in that time, Huawei trying to sell their switches, they couldn't to these two operators because we did not recommend Huawei's equipment, although they were good. So because they were not the early mover and did not put the switches earlier, if they put the switches earlier, then they could have told the operators what kind of core application to pick, or they give them a core application. We were first movers. And although we made like that year 70 something $million and start making more and more, Huawei, because it was late mover there, they couldn't sell their stuff. So they had to go back to ITS and they bought the application of ITS and they bought 1,000 employees of ITS for $1 billion in order for them to penetrate the Iraqi market and the other markets that captured by us as early movers. Then when they bought that, then the employees, 1,000 employees, they customize their core application to better work with switches of Huawei. So then after that, the next version, what's happened is the consultant suggested to the operators, to operators, it's okay to buy Ericsson, Nokia, or Huawei. And since Huawei was cheaper than Ericsson and Nokia, they started selling to this. So you see the advantage of being a first mover situation. So my company that I was working ended up making revenues, but eventually made $1 billion jump in their sales by selling their telco industry sector. And they kept the education and they kept the banking sector. So the implication for international business, there is a policy implication. The theories of international trade also matters to international business, as we said, because firms are major players on the international trade scene. And that's in the beginning of the chapter, we said that. Why we need to know about the international trade, because international business are the main players of international trade. Because of their pivotal role in the international trade, business can influence the government, trade policies, lobbying to promote the free trade or a trade restriction. And there is lots of lobbying in USA, in Canada, who can the influence the policies that made for a free trade in certain product or service or not. So this is the end of the chapter 5. Thank you.